Our featured BBB Wise Giving Alliance accredited charity seal holders for this episode are the National Urban League, Nuru International, Operation Homefront. To find out more about these and other BBB Wise Giving Alliance accredited charity seal holders, go to give.org.
You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. Data says that there are about 30% of Americans that suffer from a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue. That's a lot of people. And so today we're going to talk about an organization that's trying to help people who are dealing with these issues. And my guest today is the executive director, and her name is Alyson Niemann, of an organization called Mindful Philanthropy. And she was previously the chief operating officer back in 2020, and she's now the executive director. And Alyson is going to tell us about the work that is going on in this space, and more importantly, what her organization is doing to raise money for other organizations and to introduce funders to organizations that are working in the space of helping people who are dealing with mental health and substance abuse issues. Alyson, I want to welcome you to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Well, thank you, Art. Thank you for having me today. It's such a pleasure to speak with you and to talk a little bit more about our work in the mental health space.
Well, first, I just want to tell our listeners how we met. And it was at an event where we were sharing a panel on organizations that are addressing or working to address some of these issues. And I was immediately impressed by a number of things that I came to know about you. One of which is that you are a teacher. And having come to the teaching field a little bit late in my life, I've always found it interesting to connect with people who are teaching at the collegiate level. And in your case, just like mine, we're also teaching like nonprofit management, which is really great to find. And so we had this opportunity to talk and connect. And I just said, I need to get Alyson on the Heart of Giving podcast, just tell her story, because what you're doing it feels a bit unique to me. There's this organization out there that's trying to connect donors and organizations so that those organizations can amplify their work, but you're also trying to help those donors make good decisions about who they should be supporting.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into that. I just, again, want to just thank you for joining. But let's talk about you first. How did you even get into this whole space of mental health or even the nonprofit sector?
Yeah. So when I think about my background, I have to go back a ways. I always say that I've been in the nonprofit sector about 22 years, but really, if I think back, I think my story starts when I was probably about 10 years old. And I was an elementary school student, and I saw a problem in my local community where, it was on the cusp of kind of conservation. I think at that time we talked about it differently. And I saw this recycling problem in my local elementary school and thought maybe I can do something about that. And so I started an ecology club. And that was the first time that we got to organize a group of people and to really think about what impact and change could look like in the social impact space. So that repeated itself a number of times throughout my life in a number of different places, both in the US and globally. And part of why I enjoy teaching so much now is that I love meeting students where they are when they're 19, 20, 21, and they're thinking about, what am I going to do with my life? What's purpose look like in my career? So teaching the business of nonprofit administration and management is such an interesting thing for me personally, to interact with students who were young like me and asking those questions. So I've always been a mission-driven leader and enjoy helping others discover their purpose and how they can be impactful. But my story around mental health starts probably about 6 or 7 years ago, when I had a family member that was going through some mental health challenges, and we were trying to navigate kind of care for her and what it looked like to navigate care in an often very complex system. And I was actually flying across different states trying to find an evaluation. And I thought, this really can't be the system for mental health in the United States. And I came to find that it actually was, that just even trying to get a screening and a test, a neuropsych eval, was really challenging, and the insurance would not cover it. And so I started to think about what I wanted to put my mind to next. And it was at that time that Mindful Philanthropy was forming. In 2019, there were a number of funders who came together and saw the lack of funding around mental health, addiction, and well-being. They commissioned a report to be done at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. And the report confirmed what they thought, was that there wasn't much funding. And it also became the first framework for giving to mental health, addiction, and well-being. But rather than that report sit somewhere, they decided to activate it into an organization, and Mindful Philanthropy was born. They obviously did not know the pandemic was going to unfold, and it did, but decided to launch the organization anyway, knowing that there would be some significant impact on the nation and global mental health as a result of what was going on throughout the pandemic. And it would serve to really highlight what was already a crisis that had been forming for quite some time. So that was the early stages, the beginning of the organization. I came on a few months after the organization was founded to really build out the operations and then transition to the executive director role. But we really do envision a world in which all of philanthropy and all funders are invested in solutions to integrate mental health and well-being into the work they're doing, so that everyone has access to what they need to be well.
I was recently just thinking back to my own personal story. It may become a memoir at some point, but I think back to my first 10 or so years on this planet. And I grew up during the 1960s in a relatively poor neighborhood on a pretty contained street. We were all playing together. But back then I could see that there were some of us who were definitely different than others. And I think of this one gentleman in particular who had a severe issue. And I don't get me to diagnose what it was, but he's currently serving a life sentence for murder. I just think that, what if he could have gotten some kind of help?
Yeah.
I mean, we all knew it. We all saw it. And it was just very violent type of personality. And the interactions that he had with law enforcement and the penal system, I don't think helped, because at a very early age, he was stealing purses from women, and they would arrest him for a few days, and then he'd be back out on the streets and, sort of terrorizing all of us who didn't want to be around him so much. But I feel, looking back at it, I kind of wonder if there was something that could have been done. And maybe today, Alyson, you would know better than me. Maybe today we're doing more because we're identifying people like that, at least in some places. Because I think about my college, for instance, the number of students who are going for counseling now has skyrocketed in the last
Mm-hmm.
5 to 7 years. Skyrocketed. We're even trying to figure out how to keep pace to get them the support and help they need. We're just happy that they're coming in because they need help. But it was a different world. And I'm just curious, what has changed and
Mm-hmm.
how are we better maybe than we used to be?
Well, I mean, I think you're highlighting what is true about mental health is that mental health is really closer than we all think. We all have mental health and we can have good mental health or poor mental health. And there are people in our lives that have maybe severe mental health challenges that they're living with. We know that the data says 1 in 4 live with a mental health challenge. And then actually, it's over half the world's population will be diagnosed with a mental health challenge or condition by the age of 75, costing the global economy over $5 trillion and just 1.3 trillion in the United States alone. So this really does, I mean, we could make the case for, the economic burden, but really it's a very personal story for people. When you think about every funder and philanthropist, for the most part that I meet, reflects on how personal mental health and well-being is and their own journey. And the same is true for us. And we certainly see parts of the population that bear the burden in unfortunate ways. So in communities of color, through other populations such as LGBTQ plus population. And we also see that jails and prisons, unfortunately, are one of the largest mental health providers in the United States. And that those that experience racism and incarceration have higher risk of mental health challenges. So it is around us and it's so ingrained in our society. And so it demands really a response, right? And a system where people can access the tools they need. So when you ask what's changed, how is it getting better? I think what we're seeing is that there is increased awareness, right? That people are, to your point, they're okay with coming forward and asking for help, for counseling, for therapy, although we do see that be different among different populations. So youth are comfortable talking about it on social media platforms or with their peers. They might be a little less, reticent to reach out to an adult, although they're learning to do that more readily. But then we see in Black and Brown communities where there still is a lot of stigma, or in an older male population, or in some of the generations that maybe are your generation, my generation, and above, that it just wasn't comfortable to talk about mental health because it did have a lot of stigma attached to it. So the stigma is coming down. We're starting to see more conversations. But in terms of access and people being able to get what they need or have screenings, we have some significant work to do and progress to be made on that front.
Well, and then there are people too who just experience different kinds of trauma, which maybe we all have. And I don't know how you distinguish between trauma that you kind of overcome and trauma that you're just living with without even knowing how it manifests itself in different ways. But we go through experiences, right? All of us,
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of changed in some way by some of the things that we witness or experience or live through. And they can cause, I would suspect, longer term issues for people.
Mm-hmm.
Are we beginning to recognize? I think we're beginning to recognize that these experiences can affect people longer term. Is that fair to say? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a distinction that we have to make between what is an everyday stress or a little T trauma, so to speak, and something that someone may experience, because we do know that we need stress in kind of dosed amounts because it really helps us to have resiliency in our life, right? To overcome that. But when we talk about trauma, of course, significantly, we can talk about the adverse childhood experiences that, can lead to higher incidence of mental health challenges. And so it's so important to think about that, because for a child that might be coming into the classroom and throwing a chair, they may not need someone to send them to suspension. They may actually need someone to say, hey, what's going on at home? Oh, you're hungry. you haven't had food to eat. How can I help you? And to really understand what is going on behind some of the behavior that we might see that's coming as a result of trauma. And so we lean on a lot of experts in our work at Mindful Philanthropy who help to educate funders and philanthropy around what it looks like to understand and to invest in programs that are doing incredible work out in the community and helping to either, kind of resolve trauma or apply trauma-informed care in some of the youth-based organizations.
So let's talk a bit more about Mindful Philanthropy. You talked about how it got started, but give us a little more detail on who organized it and how it all came together. And then we can get into some of the details about the work that you do.
Yeah, I'll tell maybe the story of our board chair, Paul Heller, who really was the idea that he had been in Vanguard. He had done a number of rotations in the C-suite, was one of the early employees there. And as he lost his son to addiction, he wanted to set up a fund in his son's name. And he had a dear friend and a funder who really challenged him to think about the practices that he had learned at Vanguard and how he might apply that to his philanthropy. And through a number of meetings, the idea was, what if we could, stand up an organization that would be a catalyst for more funding going to the field? So the original idea was actually it was leverage. So for every dollar that would be invested into Mindful Philanthropy, could we then see a $25 return in philanthropic funding to the field? So essentially, that's what Mindful does, is our role is to advocate and catalyze more funding to the field and to make sure that it's going to impactful organizations that are going to really move the needle and create systems change. And we do that through collaboration and equity. But really, over the last 4 years, we've thought about what does it look like to be bold in this space and to fill gaps that really exist in the space. If you think about the other philanthropic sectors like education or criminal justice or youth, they have some long-standing practices or communities or organizations that serve to build that field. And within mental health, there really has not been that for a long time. Mental health has existed kind of as a subset of health funders doing work, in behavioral health. And so a lot of our work right now is centered around helping to build the field of mental health philanthropy through convenings that we do both digitally and in person, through guiding the field where we release strategic guidance, which we could talk a little bit more about later on a range of topics, but we have over 36 different pieces of guidance out in the field, and then uplifting high impact opportunities. So we have a portfolio of over 600 nonprofits that we get to uplift and work with through our network of 900 funders.
Wow. So you have 900 funders, 600 organizations out there doing work. That's quite a bit to pull together in a matter of a few years. What were some of the ways you were able to achieve that?
Yeah, well, we stay pretty lean and agile. And the way that we work as a team, first of all, have incredible teammates, really brilliant and smart. But we work in a way that is, kind of through rapid and iterative processes where we're looking at the field, we're getting feedback in real time from the field and from funders. We're looking at where the gaps are. We've had a number of different teammates who have played various roles within the organization. But I think for the most part, it's been able to see where the gaps are and then pivot very quickly to say, how can we do that? And then being willing to take risks to do it. For example, in our second year of operation, we started a summit called Activate, Investing in the Future of Mental Health and Wellbeing. And it was the first gathering for principal level funders that wanted to invest in mental health and well-being. And we were a small, scrappy organization with a very limited budget and looking to organize funders in a way that would have collective impact and form a community of funders. And we're in the process of planning our third one. It's been a huge success in terms of creating thought leadership in the field as well as collective action. And that's what we're looking for. That's why we called it Activate, is to really help to see those funders activated into the field and collaborating with one another. Right after the Activate 2023 last year, we had a funder go out and make a $10 million gift to youth mental health in their state because they were so inspired by the community and the conversation.
You mentioned filling gaps. What are some of the more recent gaps that you've been working to fill?
Yeah, sure. Well, about a year ago, we started doing some funder surveys and funder focus groups to say, what does the field need? How can the field grow? What are some things that you're missing? And what's preventing you from investing more in the field? And we heard a number of things from funders. First, we heard that I think it was about 51% of funders surveyed said that if they would increase their funding if they had an opportunity to collaborate. So wanting to find places where they could work with other funders, kind of de-risk their investments, know that they were working toward a coordinated and aligned purpose. So we've been working to stand up more collaborations. We recently just finished we're finishing right now, what we've called a Mental Health at the Center roadshow, where we have been bringing together funders that are either already collaborating or wanting to collaborate and starting to uplift those opportunities, both at the local level and then share best practices out into the field at a national level. What we also heard from funders is that there wasn't a clear vision or like, what are we trying to do as a field? What are we aiming for? And so we set out to create kind of a North Star, which is how could we increase funding by 5 times in the field over the next 10 years, which is a pretty big moonshot challenge right now for the field. And so we've been working to support that. What is it going to take to support the moonshot goal with tools and resources? So we first released a report in October that was the case for investment in mental health, where anyone who is looking to invest could read the report and see not only how important mental health is, but also how intersectional it is to so many other issue areas that people care about. So whether it's the criminal justice system or youth or education, mental health really is that through line through the other social issue areas and can further outcomes in those areas. So that's the case for investment. Then we released the strategy roadmap. So the roadmap to investing in mental health, where we uplifted 5 priority areas that would, if invested in a coordinated way, would really start to move our systems and transform the massive gaps that we do see within the mental health system. So those are the 2 reports that we put out that have been really filling a lot of the knowledge gaps and the gaps we heard from funders as to we just don't have what we need to invest. We don't know where to invest. And then we're working on 2 follow-up reports that include who's funding what where, so they know who their peers are and where they can go to collaborate. And then how do we know what success looks like? So how do we measure the work that we're doing? We really don't have metrics right now within philanthropy and mental health that shows us if we're on the right track. So we're working both with nonprofits on the ground and funders to help establish kind of a rubric for those success metrics.
And now it's time for our Giving Tips segment with Bennett Weiner, one of the world's most renowned experts on charity accountability and the COO of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance.
Today I'd like to talk to you about veterans and military service charities. These groups are one of the most trusted types of charities that we report on. And we've done donor trust report surveys of about 2,000 Americans on an annual basis. And veterans organizations generally are towards the top of the most trusted type of charity. And I think that's the case for a number of different reasons. But one of those is a popular cause. People are concerned about vets and they want to help them, as well as those engaged in military service activities that may need assistance of some kind. That's a type of organization that the public is very sympathetic to. So there are a number of things to keep in mind when considering a gift to such an organization. One is, what actually are they carrying out? What's the nature of their activities? Some of these organizations are involved with employment issues and helping to get vets into jobs. I think probably one of the focused areas, especially in recent years, is mental health services, where there's been increased recognition of the importance of mental health service programs for veterans, especially those who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And there may be wounded veterans that may need assistance in their daily living situations, or other veterans that may need help with benefits or advocacy and trying to get the benefits from the VA, or maybe some assistance with housing or scholarship programs for education. Bottom line is, don't assume what the organization does based on the name alone. Check their website out to see what they're about, and also visit our report on give.org to see if the charity that you have in mind meets the 20 BBB charity standards.
Well, I have to say, you kind of make this sound easy. You stand up a nonprofit and you talk about you want to help mental health, want to fill some of the mental health gaps. And then suddenly you have all these funders and organizations that are working together. It couldn't have been that easy. How did you make this happen? And what were some of the real drawbacks and walls that you had to either scale or knock down to make it happen?
You're right. It's not easy. In fact, the mental health sector is one of the most complex sectors. We talk about some of the challenges, then the silos that are out there within the system and data sharing. But I will say our team is incredibly dedicated. The board is incredibly dedicated and knowledgeable. And we work through a network of experts and researchers that help to inform our work and inform the direction that we go and how we steer funders. But I think there's also been some learnings for us along the way. One is we're a field building organization. And so we work with a lot of place-based funders. And we work with national funders and global funders, but then we ourselves are a nonprofit. And so we're thinking about how do we stand up best practices? And we're about to close out Mental Health Awareness Month. And, I always say to our team that even though it's Mental Health Awareness Month, we have to think about how do we take care of our own mental health, and we'll celebrate in June because we have so many demands on our time in the month of May that it's really challenging to practice the things that our mental health days and the things that we have as part of our practices. We do Summer Fridays, which started this week, and we really do try to take care of our own mental health and support one another. So quite a dedicated team. And I think that all stems from personal interactions and personal experiences in mental health with either loved ones, family members, or friends that were very driven to see something change. And then I think we are really good at just hearing from one another how we can pivot. I will say one of the most challenging things that we have experienced is in the last 4 years, the landscape of who's coming into the field, whether it's nonprofits or funders, has changed so dramatically. And so we're consistently kind of analyzing the landscape and saying, okay, what are the nonprofits doing the work? Who are the funders that are coming into this space? And we're seeing a lot of replication in the field, which can be both good and bad in the nonprofit sector, but also a little bit confusing, right, for the sector writ large to say, how do we organize and how do we be effective and how do we have a shared identity? And I think for our team, the pace of the work over the last few years has been challenging. There's so much good we want to do, and there's so much work at our fingertips, and yet it's very fast paced to keep up kind of with the demand and the desire for change that I think we see coming about with mental health right now.
So you mentioned change. What are some of the major changes that you've seen over the last several years?
Yeah, I would say whenever we've been doing this roadshow over the last few months, we have been talking with funders about who's been in the space a long time. And I would say probably 5 years ago, there weren't as many organizations funding youth mental health. Now we see that a good number of organizations are either trying to serve mental health of youth, and so they're integrating programs into their existing organizations, or they're standing up new organizations. And I would say of all of the areas where we work in, I think it's typically between 60 and 70% of funders that we work with want to fund and have an impact in youth mental health. So, and most of it is because everyone knows a youth who might be experiencing either poor mental health or challenging circumstances right now in their periphery. And so they're saying, how can I actually have an impact and change, one of the young lives that I see around me? So I think that is one of the biggest changes we've seen. The other thing is that while there's been a lot of attention to mental health, we're currently not seeing it translate into really big gifts to the field.
Mm.
In 2019, there was the largest gift given to mental health, addiction, and well-being from the Huntsman Family Foundation. We haven't really seen any gifts like that lately, even though there has been an uptick in attention. So I would say maybe that's one thing that hasn't changed, is that funding, we haven't seen translate the interest into huge amounts of funding, even though we're continuing to work in the space and what we're hearing from funders is that they are working on their strategy and they're thinking about ways to be smart in the space. And so we do hope and anticipate that that translates into more funding and increased funding over the next few years. And then I think there's been a greater awareness of how we, in particularly, have to serve and solve for the workforce issue. So you can't talk about mental health and well-being without thinking about the shortage of workforce, which is leading to alternative forms of workforce, such as peer support and other community supports, or the formation of new degree programs and behavioral health certification programs. So I think that's been a positive change, although it's still in the innovation early idea stage and beginning to be at a place where it could be scaled.
In 5 to 10 years, are we looking at 40% or are we looking at 20% of the population impacted?
I hope that number goes down. I hope that a couple of things. I hope that the public has the tools and resources to know what is good mental health and how do we develop good mental health more broadly. And then I hope that those with severe mental illness, that we have figured out ways to make that one of the biggest barriers to treating those with severe mental illness right now is that we don't have cost-effective solutions. It is, we lose money in the treatment. And so it's not motivating for those insurance and payers to come to the table. So I do hope that we have some solutions where we can treat those with serious mental illness in places where it feels like home and it's good access, it's value-based care, and it's also a fundable opportunity on many levels.
Yeah.
And we're working really hard on that in some local areas right now. But I think I'm hopeful that with the increase in the awareness on mental health and well-being, that we'll get there.
But that's going to take more funders too, though, right? So
it is going to take more funders, and it's going to take more funders across more sectors, which is why we issued the call to action to all of philanthropy, not just to those that identify as a mental health funder. It really is a call for education funders and youth funders and criminal justice funders to take up the work of mental health and to really educate themselves and their grantee partners on what does this look like to reimagine mental health in the United States and across the world.
Well, it's so interesting. You talked about how the shift that you've seen is that organizations that may not have been engaging in mental health activities before are putting that in as part of their program, right? So if you are an after-school program, I'm just assuming that maybe you are adding in mental health identification. All right, we see that there's a problem here with one of the kids we're dealing with. We want to make sure that that kid is getting treated or that the parents are at least aware of what we're seeing. And now we want to find, I'm throwing this out there. I don't know if this is true, but you can correct me, but it just seems to me natural that an organization dealing with a kid might want to do that. I mean, a YMCA might want to say, we got these kids here who are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're doing more. So you would think that because everything is so interconnected,
yep,
that if you're funding one of these organizations, that you're funding mental health without even knowing it, because you're supporting that organization that needs to do that.
And that's exactly what we hear from funders, actually, is that they come to us saying, we have to figure out how to fund this in a way that is meaningful and impactful because we're getting requests from our grantees. And they're asking for funds to integrate mental health and well-being. And so it's two sides, right? It's helping the nonprofit organizations to integrate mental health in a very responsible and evidence and community practiced way, while also helping the funders to think about how do you actually make investments and support the grantees in a way that's going to one, be strategic in your portfolio, but then two, affect systems change within the broader system. And there are some really interesting opportunities that are out there for funders right now. You think about what are the different kinds of people that interact with youth all the time, for example, that maybe haven't been mobilized. So, I was just last week speaking with someone and we were talking about coaches, right? How many coaches interact with youth hours and hours a week? When I think about my own kids and swimming practices and all the other sports things that they're in, and yet we don't have a lot of certifications or trainings for, and particularly for mental health around coaches. And there are some organizations doing phenomenal work with a vision to mobilize millions of coaches over the next few years. And we know that sports can act as a protective factor in sports in youth. So I think there are some great innovations out there and integrations of mental health into those organizations as well as where youth are, right?
And it's important that we collaborate. I just did a show last week on collaboration. I had written these 9 considerations back in 2017 for organizations that want to think about collaborating. And I began to think about what's happened since then and how these principles are probably more needed today than before. But also we need to think even differently since then because of the shifts that we've seen. Maybe now through tools, technological tools, we can find better collaborators. Maybe we can
absolutely
just think through using generative AI. How might we collaborate with organizations in a way that aligns with the way we operate and the approaches that we think are important? How can we better integrate, as you say, mental health into our programming? So there are opportunities, I think, for organizations to think differently about collaborating and have organizations be maybe willing to partner with them that may never have thought about it before, just because we see that everything is so connected.
Yeah. I love that, Art. And I think, especially when we think about mental health, who are the unlikely collaborators, as someone said to me recently, and 80% of the factors that influence health are found outside of the health system, which is why, especially when we're talking about mental health, it's why community and social connection and belonging and purpose are so important. And it does bring some unlikely collaborators to the table. I just last week was with a number of funders that we partner with, but we started the partnership with the Aspen Institute, where we around opportunity youth and helping funders to think about integration of belonging, meaning, well-being, and purpose into the work that they're doing with youth. And it's a great place to start. They're already working with youth where they might be more at risk for mental health challenges and loneliness and isolation. And so how can we bring that work into the work that they're already doing? So we're grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with folks like that and excited always to collaborate with more people.
Yeah. Well, I got one last question for you. And
Sure.
I'm an older person, so I love what's happening with youth because maybe some of them won't have to go through what we went through as children, have basically our situation be ignored, toughen up. Pray. Praying is good, but you need some science behind it sometimes too. But I think about how there might be some intergenerational opportunities, right, to be supportive, young and old, and middle age, and so forth. I know the Eisner Foundation, where my friend Trent Stamp is the head. I don't know if you've done anything with them, but you might want to look them up.
Yeah, I would love to.
Trent Stamp has been there for a number of years, but they've also discovered that working cross-generationally can be very meaningful in dealing with some of these issues. I don't know if you've come across any of that in the work that you've done.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point because we do see that older generations are really struggling with loneliness and isolation in ways that they never have before and did during the pandemic, right? Especially those who maybe were in retirement communities or assisted living. And yet it's a perfect opportunity for them to be able to give back to youth and for youth to to learn and to think about how older generations have approached mental health. And we hear from people that there is that bi-directional learning. There is an organization that the Friendship Bench that comes from the global South, and where they've just had older people sitting on a bench and being able to listen, right? And I think that sometimes even I see with my own youth that are in my life, whether it's students or my teens, that sometimes they need to get out of their own echo chamber, right? And say, hey, how can I learn a little bit more about what older generations have gone through? And I love seeing that. I was just with family and older generations over the holiday weekend where that was happening. So I think that's such a great point. And there's so much to learn on both sides, and whether how from the younger generations to the older generations, how they think and talk about their mental health, and then giving purpose to the older generations and how they pour out and pour into the younger generation.
Well, Alyson, tell our listeners how they can connect with you. There may be some funders or some organizations out there that might want to find out more about your work. How can they reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can always reach us at our website, mindfulphilanthropy.org. And if you're looking to sign up for our newsletter that happens every month, we also have some exciting things that are rolling out over the summer that will include really helping to develop our community. You can email us at info@mindfulphilanthropy.org, and we'll get you signed up so you can stay up to date with the latest things coming out from Mindful Philanthropy.
Wonderful. Well, to our listeners, you've been listening to Alyson Niemann. She is the executive director of Mindful Philanthropy, and they are doing groundbreaking work to help connect funders and organizations that are dealing with what I'd like to consider almost like an epidemic here in the United States, and maybe a pandemic worldwide, with mental illness and mental discomfort and all of the related issues. If you're interested, you heard how to get in touch with her. Now, if you're just listening to this podcast for the first time, you should know that this is a weekly show. It comes out every Tuesday, a new episode, and you'll hear an outstanding leader like you have today. So we hope you will subscribe by going to any major podcast platform. And if you want to support the podcast, that would be great too. You can do that by going to our website at give.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.